Leo strode through the automatic glass doors, his carry-on suitcase rolling behind him as the airport's PA system echoed through the terminal. Flight 207 to New York will be departing in 2 hours. Passengers, please proceed to security screening. He checked his watch, plenty of time. But this wasn't just another flight. This trip could determine the future of an entire airline. And Leo Carter was at the center of it all. However, as he approached the security checkpoint, an eerie sense of déjà vu crept over him. He had traveled through countless airports worldwide, each time bracing for the moment when a simple glance at his passport would shift the entire atmosphere. It always happened. He placed his passport and boarding pass on the scanner. Officer Bryant, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp gaze, took them without a word. He flipped open the passport, his eyes scanning the details. Then, it happened. Bryant's brow furrowed. He looked down, then up, his scrutiny now far more intense. Sir? Step aside. The entire energy of the checkpoint changed. Leo froze for half a second. He had been through this before, yet it never failed to ignite that slow-burning fire of frustration inside him. Not because he didn't expect it, but because he knew it shouldn't have to happen every single time. Keeping his voice steady, he asked, "Is there a problem? We just need to verify something. Please step over here." A few passengers in line stole glances at him. Some whispered, curiosity flickering in their eyes. The weight of their stares pressed against Leo's skin, making him feel like he was being dissected right there, in public. A long pause. He took a slow breath. But deep down, he knew exactly where this was going. Bryant held up his passport. "Your passport says female." The words sliced through the air like a cold blade. Leo clenched his jaw. Not again. His grip on the suitcase handle tightened, but his expression remained calm. "Yes, that's a clerical error. I am a man." Bryant remained unfazed. He folded his arms. "Rules are rules. You need to go through the women's screening section." A rush of heat shot through Leo's veins. It wasn't just humiliation. It was the way one sentence could strip away years of fighting for recognition. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some people watched with pity, others with curiosity, but most, they simply stood by and observed, like spectators waiting for a spectacle to unfold. Leo clenched his fists, holding back the frustration clawing at his chest. He couldn't lose his temper, but he also couldn't back down. Not this time. Not here. So, what would he do? Comply and get this over with quickly, or stand his ground, knowing it would cause more complications? Taking a deep breath, Leo lifted his chin, locking eyes with Officer Bryant. "I'm not going in there." Bryant's brows knitted in annoyance. "You don't have a choice. These are regulations." But Leo simply shrugged, his voice unwavering. "Then detain me if you must. But I suggest you check my information again before making any decisions." Bryant stared at him, confused. What he didn't realize, what no one around them knew, was that in just a few minutes, he would discover he had made a grave mistake. What would you do if you were in Leo's position? Would you comply or stand your ground? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Officer Bryant's stare was sharp, assessing. For a moment, he didn't move, as if calculating his next step. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on Leo like the weight of 1,000 stairs. A few feet away, the line of passengers waiting to pass through security had slowed to a crawl, curious eyes darting toward the unfolding scene. Some whispered. Others merely watched, their expressions unreadable. Leo refused to look away. He had spent years enduring moments like this, times when people thought they could dictate who he was based on outdated paperwork and their own narrow perception of reality. "I need you to step over to the women's security lane," Bryant repeated, his tone flat, matter of fact. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Leo kept his voice even. "That's not happening. I'm a man. I belong in this line." Bryant let out a slow, measured breath, his eyes darkening. "That's not what your passport says." Leo felt his patience fray. "And what exactly does my passport say about my identity beyond a label assigned at birth?" His words were calm, but there was an edge beneath them. Something sharp, something immovable. Bryant shifted his stance, and for the first time, Leo sensed hesitation. That's right. He wasn't dealing with someone who had absolute power here. "Look," Bryant finally said, his voice lowering as if to offer some misguided sense of discretion. "I don't make the rules. You need to comply or you'll be detained for non-compliance. That's not a good situation for you." Leo huffed out a bitter laugh. "Oh, is it not? And what situation is good for me? Officer? Being forced into a security check that doesn't align with who I am? Being humiliated in front of dozens of people?" He gestured toward the crowd forming around them. Bryant's jaw tightened. He didn't like being called out. Neither did Leo. "I'm not going anywhere," Leo said, his voice steel. Bryant's nostrils flared as he lifted his radio. "Security backup requested at checkpoint B2. Passenger refusing compliance." Leo barely reacted. He had expected this. A ripple of murmurs passed through the line. People sensed the shift. The way a simple check had turned into something else entirely. A standoff. A woman in line, a middle-aged passenger with short blonde hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, folding her arms. "What exactly is the problem here?" Bryant shot her a quick, annoyed glance. "Ma'am, this is a private security matter." "Private?" She scoffed. "Half the damn airport is watching. This man is being harassed because of a technicality, and I don't think any of us are comfortable with that." Leo turned toward her, surprised. He didn't know her, but in that moment, she had just become an ally. Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, this seems unnecessary," a younger man in line muttered. More murmurs followed. "Support." A ripple turning into a wave. Bryant exhaled sharply. "This isn't up for debate. Rules are rules." But before he could continue, another figure approached, the shift supervisor, a woman in a dark blue uniform, clearly someone with more authority than Bryant. She frowned as she surveyed the scene. "What's going on here?" Bryant stepped forward quickly. "Passenger's documentation doesn't match his presented gender. He's refusing to comply with standard screening procedures." The supervisor's gaze flicked to Leo, studying him for a moment. "Is this true?" she asked. Leo squared his shoulders. "I'm being asked to enter a security check that doesn't match my identity. I'm telling you that's not happening." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then, her eyes flicked toward his passport still clutched in Bryant's hand. She leaned over and scanned the name. And then, something changed. Her brows knitted together. A flicker of realization, she quickly turned toward Bryant, her voice sharp. "Where did you say he was flying?" "New York," Bryant replied. Confused, the supervisor hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Leo caught it. Bryant noticed it too. "Is there a problem?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. The supervisor glanced at Leo, then back at Bryant, and her next word sent a visible jolt through the tension-filled air. "Run his name through the internal system." Bryant blinked. "What?" "Now," she repeated. For the first time since this started, Bryant looked uncertain. Leo remained quiet, waiting, watching. A second passed. Then two. Bryant hesitated, but eventually pulled out his tablet, inputting Leo's details. The moment he hit enter, the screen changed, and Bryant's expression went pale. He stared at the screen for far too long. Too long. His grip on the tablet tightened slightly, his eyes scanning the information again, as if he had misread it. The supervisor sighed, rubbing her temples. "I thought so." Bryant's voice was barely above a whisper. This can't be right." Leo remained silent. He already knew exactly what Bryant was looking at. The shift supervisor turned toward Bryant and spoke the words that flipped the power dynamic in an instant. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Leo watched as Bryant swallowed, his gaze no longer filled with arrogance, but something else, something dangerously close to fear. And just like that, the tides had turned. Bryant's grip on the tablet tightened, his knuckles turning white as his eyes darted back and forth over the screen. He was frozen. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Leo knew exactly what was happening. Bryant had just discovered who he really was, or rather, who he had power over until now. The shift supervisor let out a sharp exhale, breaking the tense silence. She turned to Bryant, her voice low but firm. "You need to release him. Now." Bryant's jaw clenched. He wasn't just confused, he was panicking. The other security officers around them, sensing something was wrong, began whispering amongst themselves. The murmurs spread like wildfire. People in line leaned in, sensing that this was no longer just about a routine security check. Leo stood completely still, watching. He could see the exact moment Bryant realized he had made a grave mistake. "This has to be some kind of error," Bryant muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The shift supervisor shot him a sharp look. "Does it look like an error?" Bryant didn't answer. His chest rose and fell heavily, and then a voice cut through the tension. "Can someone explain what's happening here?" It was the blonde woman from earlier, the one who had defended Leo. She stepped forward, arms folded, brows raised. Around her, other passengers nodded in agreement. "Yeah, why was he pulled aside in the first place?" a young man asked, glancing between Bryant and the supervisor. "This doesn't seem right at all," another woman murmured. Leo watched as Bryant's face flushed red, not just with frustration but with the realization that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. The people around them were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses, and that made Bryant dangerous. "This is a security matter," Bryant snapped, his voice rising. "Everyone stay out of it." But the passengers weren't backing down. "A security matter? Looks more like discrimination to me," the blonde woman shot back. Several others murmured in agreement. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. The confrontation had escalated into something bigger than just one man being held back at security. It was now about principles. Bryant turned back to the shift supervisor, voice strained. "I don't care who he is, rules are rules. If we let him go without the proper screening, we're making exceptions, and that's not how this works." Leo tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Oh? Now you're concerned about fairness?" His voice was calm but sharp, cutting through Bryant's thinly veiled excuse like a blade. Bryant's lips pressed into a thin line. The power balance had shifted completely. And Leo? He knew exactly what to do next. With deliberate slowness, he turned to the shift supervisor. "May I?" She hesitated, but then gave him a small nod. Leo took a step forward. "I suggest you check your facts before you talk about rules." "Officer Bryant." The crowd fell silent. "Because right now, you're making a scene out of the wrong person." Leo held Bryant's gaze for a long moment. Letting the words settle, "I have the authority to walk through this checkpoint, board my flight, and continue my day without being harassed. But instead, you decided to create a public spectacle, one that's about to get a lot bigger than you anticipated." Bryant's eyes widened slightly. Leo took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough for only Bryant and the supervisor to hear. "Tell me, officer," he said, his tone almost conversational, "how do you think your superiors will react when they hear that you just detained someone with direct influence over your airline's policies?" Bryant flinched. Leo watched as realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. Because now, Bryant understood. Leo wasn't just some passenger. He was a stakeholder, a voice in decisions far bigger than this single security checkpoint. Someone who could dictate policy changes that might just end Bryant's career. And that was when Bryant finally understood the depth of his mistake. For the first time, his arrogance wavered. Leo could see it in the slight twitch of his fingers, the way his shoulders tensed. And for the first time, Bryant didn't know what to do next. The shift supervisor, sensing Bryant's hesitation, stepped in immediately. "This situation has been mishandled," she announced, her voice carrying through the growing crowd. She turned to Bryant, her tone clipped. "You're done here. Step back." Bryant's entire body stiffened. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Not now, not when the weight of his mistake was pressing down on him. Leo didn't move. He simply stood there, waiting, watching, letting Bryant feel every second of the power shift. And then, finally, Bryant took a step back. A collective breath seemed to be released from the passengers. The energy in the air shifted. Leo didn't smile. He simply adjusted his posture, straightened his blazer, and turned back toward the checkpoint. Without another word, the shift supervisor gestured for him to move forward. No extra screenings. No more questions. Just the silent acknowledgement that they had made a mistake. As Leo walked past Bryant, he said only one thing, just loud enough for the man to hear. Next time, think before you assume you know who you're dealing with. And with that, Leo stepped forward unbothered, undefeated, and in full control of his own damn narrative. Leo walked forward, past the checkpoint, past the security officers, past Bryant, who was now standing rigid, his entire world seemingly flipped upside down in a matter of minutes. But something wasn't right. Leo could feel it, a shift in the air. It wasn't just the embarrassment on Bryant's face or the collective whispers spreading through the terminal like wildfire. There was something else. As he moved toward the boarding gates, he noticed how the shift supervisor was watching him. Her face was composed, but her eyes? They held something different. A hint of recognition, a flicker of concern, a subtle tension in her posture that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Leo did. And then, the radio clipped to her shoulder crackled to life. HQ, we need an update on passenger Carter. Leo stopped in his tracks. A pause, then a low, static-filled response. Passenger Leo Carter has restricted clearance. Immediate notification required. His blood ran cold. Restricted clearance? Immediate notification? Leo turned sharply, eyes locking onto the shift supervisor. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking past him, toward two other security officers who had just been called in, their expressions unreadable. His pulse quickened. This was something else. This wasn't about his passport mismatch. This wasn't just a mistake at security. This was planned. Leo knew better than to panic, but his mind was already racing. How? Why? He had traveled through this airport countless times, always with priority boarding, always without issue, except for the occasional gender marker debate, which he had grown tired of. So why now? What had changed? His hands instinctively tightened around the handle of his carry-on. I need to think fast. He turned to the shift supervisor, his voice calm but firm. You want to tell me what's going on? She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But that was enough. She knew exactly what this was. But instead of answering, she turned her attention back to Bryant. Escort Mr. Carter to the waiting lounge immediately, she said. Her tone clipped, authoritative. Bryant visibly tensed. Leo caught it instantly, the way Bryant's entire demeanor shifted. From anger to apprehension, from arrogance to restraint, Bryant wasn't in control anymore. Leo realized something else, too. This wasn't just a routine delay. This was bigger. The way the shift supervisor had spoken to Bryant, she had overridden him. She had the final say, which meant this was coming from higher up. Leo's heartbeat thudded in his ears. The waiting lounge was empty when they arrived. Too empty. Bryant didn't say a word, but Leo could see the tension in his stance. His hands hovered too close to his belt, near where his radio sat clipped. Leo sat down, his mind spinning. Something was off. No airline officials, no additional passengers, no customer service staff. Nothing. Just him and Bryant, and the distant muffled voices crackling through the radios of other security officers. This wasn't protocol. Leo knew aviation security inside and out. Something was happening behind the scenes, and it had to do with him. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Then, finally, the shift supervisor reappeared, stepping inside the lounge. Bryant stood at attention. Leo remained seated. Watching her carefully, she exhaled, pressing a button on her earpiece, then looked directly at him. Mr. Carter, we need to have a conversation. Leo tilted his head, feigning confusion. Is that so? She didn't react to his sarcasm. Instead, she took out a file, a physical file. That alone sent a red flag through Leo's mind. No one used paper records anymore, not unless they wanted to keep something off digital logs. She placed it on the table, then slid it toward him. Leo glanced down, and everything clicked. The document was old, years old, stamped in bold, black ink at the top, restricted, confidential clearance only. His name was on the first page. But it wasn't just his name. It was a different identity, a name he hadn't used in a long time. His stomach tightened. This was about his past. Leo looked up slowly, meeting the supervisor's gaze. "Why do you have this?" She didn't blink. "Because, Mr. Carter, someone very high up wants to know why you're boarding a flight today." Leo's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what this was. Someone had flagged his name. Someone who knew who he really was. Not Leo Carter. Not the businessman. Not the corporate consultant. Not the airline stakeholder. But the person he had once been. The identity he had buried. And now, they had dug it up. The room felt smaller. The air, heavier. Leo stared at the file in front of him, his mind racing. This shouldn't exist anymore. Years ago, he had buried this part of his life. Yet, here it was, unearthed. He looked up at the shift supervisor, his expression unreadable. "I'll ask again," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "Why do you have this?" She didn't flinch. "Because, Mr. Carter," she said evenly, "you are not just a passenger. You are a priority." A slow, creeping chill ran down Leo's spine. A priority for who? She slid the file open, tapping on a specific document inside. Leo's breath caught in his throat. Because there, stamped in bold red letters at the top, were the words, "Hold for clearance, restricted access," and underneath it, his true name. Not Leo Carter, Leonardo St. James, the missing heir to St. James Aviation Group, the company that owned the very airline he was about to fly on. Leo inhaled slowly, keeping his face unreadable. But inside, his pulse pounded. It had been years since he last heard that name. Years since he walked away from it, from his family, from their empire, from the weight of a legacy he never wanted. And now, they had found him. Leo's grip tightened on the edge of the table. "I see," he said, voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The supervisor leaned forward slightly. "We've been monitoring flagged names in our system for a long time," she said. "Yours came up this morning. And before you ask, no, we weren't looking for you. Someone else was." Leo's breath stilled. "Who?" She hesitated. Just for a second. Then, "Your father." His stomach twisted. He clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay calm. "Stay unreadable. That's impossible," he said flatly. The supervisor's gaze didn't waver. "You know it's not." Leo pushed the file back across the table. "I left that world a long time ago. And yet, here you are, still tied to it," she replied smoothly. He exhaled through his nose. "What does my father want?" Her expression turned unreadable. "Not your father." Leo frowned. "What?" She reached into the file, pulling out a recent news clipping. Leo's stomach dropped. The headline read, "Mysterious Shakeup at St. James Aviation, CEO steps down. New leadership unclear." He scanned the article, his heart hammering. The company, the airline empire his father built, was in turmoil. His father was gone. And now, someone was looking for the heir he had cut off years ago. Him. Leo pressed a hand against his temple, his mind racing. He had walked away from everything. The power, the money, the St. James name. He had built his own life, one that had nothing to do with them. But now, they wanted him back. Why? What had changed? He looked up at the supervisor, narrowing his eyes. "You're saying I've been flagged in your system because my family wants to find me?" She shook her head. "No. You were flagged because someone from the board of directors issued a travel restriction on your name yesterday. That means someone doesn't want you on this flight. Someone doesn't want you anywhere near New York." A shiver ran down Leo's spine. This wasn't a reunion attempt. This was a warning. For the first time in years, Leo felt something he thought he had left behind. The pull of his past. The world of power plays. Silent wars waged in executive boardrooms. Deals made over handshakes that could destroy entire empires. The same world he had walked away from. And yet, here it was, pulling him back in. He had a choice. Board that flight and find out what was really happening, or turn around and disappear forever. For a moment, He considered walking away, letting them fight their own battles. But deep down, Leo knew this wasn't over. This was just beginning. He leaned forward, locking eyes with the supervisor. "Lift the hold on my name." She hesitated. "Mr. Carter, do it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, finally, she nodded. Understood. Leo stood up, grabbed his carry-on, and without another word, walked toward his gate. Determined, ready, and heading straight into the storm waiting for him in New York. Leo walked through the terminal, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He was back in control. Or at least, he thought he was. As he approached Gate 17, he caught a glimpse of the large windows overlooking the tarmac. His flight was still there, idling, waiting. But something wasn't right. The boarding gate was eerily quiet. Too quiet. No line of passengers. No final calls from attendants. Just two men in suits standing near the counter. Their posture stiff, their eyes sharp as they tracked Leo's movements. A warning bell rang inside his head. This isn't over. Leo kept walking, forcing himself to stay calm. If they were waiting for him, they wanted him to react. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He reached the counter and pulled out his boarding pass. "Leo Carter, Flight 207 to New York." The gate agent, a woman in her early 30s, her smile too tight, too forced, took his pass. Then she hesitated. Her gaze flicked to the two men standing nearby. Leo's stomach tightened. Slowly, one of them stepped forward, flashing a badge. Not airport security. Not TSA. Something else. "Mr. Carter, we need you to come with us." Leo didn't move. "On what grounds?" His voice was steady, but inside, his mind was racing. The man barely blinked. For security reasons. Bullshit. They weren't stopping the plane. They were stopping him. Leo exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. He had spent years navigating power struggles, understanding how systems worked, who controlled what, who had the upper hand. Right now, they were testing him. They expected him to follow, to comply, to walk willingly into whatever trap they were setting. But they didn't expect him to fight back. "Am I being detained?" His voice was casual. Too casual. The man hesitated, just for a second. "No, sir." But Leo smirked. That was all he needed. "Then I'll be boarding my flight." He reached for his boarding pass, but the agent didn't give it back. The two men tensed. Leo turned slightly, just enough so the passengers in the waiting area could see what was happening. The airport was busy. Hundreds of people. The last thing these men wanted? A scene. And Leo knew exactly how to use that to his advantage. "Is there a problem?" he asked, raising his voice just enough. A few people turned. A few phones tilted up, recording. One of the suited men took a step closer. "Mr. Carter, we highly recommend you come with us." Leo's smirk didn't fade. "And I highly recommend you let me board my flight unless you have a legal reason to hold me here." The tension crackled. For a moment, neither side moved. Then, the shift supervisor from earlier appeared, striding toward the gate with purpose. She looked irritated. "What's going on here?" she demanded, crossing her arms. The man with the badge barely reacted. "We have orders." "From who?" she cut in. Another pause. This time, longer. The men exchanged a glance. That was all Leo needed. Someone had ordered this. Someone who didn't want him in New York. But the fact that these men couldn't say who meant there was a crack in their authority. Leo took the opening. Seems like no one here knows who's really in charge. His voice was casual, but laced with precision. The words hit their mark. Passengers were watching now. The shift supervisor's jaw tightened. Then, after a long beat, she turned to the gate agent. "Is there a reason Mr. Carter shouldn't be allowed to board?" The woman hesitated. Then, finally, "No, ma'am." Leo's grin widened. The man with the badge exhaled through his nose, frustrated, but they had lost. There was no justifiable reason to hold him any longer. And if they tried, they risked making this far more public than they wanted. Finally, with visible reluctance, the suited man stepped back. Leo took his boarding pass from the agent's trembling fingers. Then, with a satisfied nod, he turned, and walked straight onto the jet bridge. As he settled into his seat, he exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He had won this round, but this wasn't over. Not even close. Someone had tried to stop him. Not with brute force, not with legal restrictions, but with deliberate obstacles. They wanted him delayed, controlled, manipulated. Why? Who was really pulling the strings? As the plane taxied down the runway, Leo pulled out his phone, a single new message from an unknown number. His stomach dropped as he read the words. You should have taken the hint. Now, you're flying straight into the fire. Leo stared at the screen. Then, slowly, he smiled. Because for the first time in years, he was exactly where he needed to be. Leo settled into his seat, the hum of the aircraft filling the cabin as the final passengers boarded. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. His phone vibrated. He glanced down. A restricted number. Leo's pulse quickened. They didn't waste any time. He let it ring once, twice. Then, finally, he answered. Mr. Carter. A deep, smooth voice. Familiar. Too familiar. Leo closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. Staring out the window, I assume you're calling to welcome me home? A low chuckle on the other end. Home? I don't recall you ever calling it that. Leo's fingers tightened around the phone. What do you want? A pause. You already know the answer. Leo, it's time to come back. You belong in this family, in this business. Whether you like it or not, you still hold a stake in what happens next. Leo scoffed. So that was it. Sane. James Aviation wasn't just in trouble, they were desperate. And now, the family he had walked away from wanted him back. I'm sure the board has plenty of capable people. Leo said, keeping his voice light. I doubt they need a runaway heir to fix things. The voice on the other end darkened. You think this is about need? This is about control. Leo's jaw clenched. And who exactly is in control here? A slow exhale. That depends on the choice you make next. Leo leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Let me make one thing clear, he said, voice sharp as a blade. I walked away once, and I can do it again. I don't owe you, or the board, or anyone else a damn thing. Silence. Then perhaps. But Leo, don't mistake walking away for winning. Click. The line went dead. Leo stared at his phone, jaw tight. A flight attendant approached, offering a polite smile. Would you like something to drink before takeoff? Sir? Leo exhaled, his grip loosening around his phone. Whiskey? Neat. If his past wanted him back, it would have to fight for him. Because this time, Leo wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was coming for the throne. The plane cruised at 35, 0 feet, the dim cabin lights casting a soft glow over the passengers. The glass of whiskey in Leo's hand remained untouched, the amber liquid swirling slightly as the turbulence rocked the aircraft. His mind wasn't on the drink. It was on the war waiting for him in New York. For years, he had built a life outside of the St. James name. He had cut ties, erased the last remnants of a legacy he never wanted. But now, they had dragged him back into their game. And there was only one way out. Win. His phone vibrated again. Another anonymous message. Leo glanced at it, already knowing it wouldn't be good. We know you're coming. Be careful who you trust. His grip on the glass tightened. This wasn't just about power anymore. This was about survival. He exhaled slowly, then lifted the glass to his lips, taking a single slow sip. If they thought they could intimidate him, they had underestimated who he had become. Leo Carter wasn't just a name. He was a threat. And when the plane landed, they would know exactly why. What would you do if you were in Leo's shoes? Step into the power he never wanted, or burn it all to the ground? Drop your thoughts below. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.